Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Build It series. This is the third video in which we're talking about the welcome window, and we're going to be covering how we can work with the right side of the welcome window showing the recently opened projects. So there are sort of two different states to this. One is where you don't have any projects that are recent, and so it'll just say no recent projects, or you have a table view displaying all of the recent projects that you've opened with a pretty simple cell. It simply contains an image that represents the icon, and then there's the title of the file itself without the extension, and then there's just the file path to the folder that contains that file. So that's pretty much all there is. There's not too much left, and we're just going to be kind of covering some of the basics and how we can inject some of these URLs and display this sort of table and then this label on the left that you see here. All right, I've gone ahead and added a few different things that are just going to be useful to get similar functionality. And I've gone ahead and also created the cell just so we can kind of skip over some of the menial stuff. And I've covered how to do all of this in previous Cocoa programming tutorials if you really have no idea how to make a table view cell. But one of the things I've gone ahead and added is this table view or NS table view subclass called table view. And the simple functionality that this adds is the ability to trigger the double action, and double action is a property of NS table view such that when you double click a cell, double action will be called, sending that to the target. And basically what I'm doing here is just implementing it so that the double action also gets fired when we hit the return key. So that's what I'm doing here is when we hit key down, and the key code is 36, which is the return key. When we happen to fire that, we're just going to send off the double action to whatever the target is. And the nice thing about this is that the same behavior both for when we double click on a cell, or if I've already had the cell selected and I hit return, both the same action will be called in that scenario. So that's really just a simple subclass for NS table view to get that functionality. And then there's a file table cell view, which is just a subclass of NS table cell view. I've added this extra property for subtitle label, and I'm reusing there's a built-in image view and text field properties on NS table cell view, which I'm just going to reuse to assign both an image, a string value, and string value to these different labels down here. Some of the complexity here, well, I wouldn't really say it's complexity, but some of the logic, I guess, that is performed here is that we're going to configure this table cell view with a URL, and based on that URL, we're going to populate the contents of the view. So there's a call in NS workspace where you can get the icon for a given file path. And what I'm doing here is basically just using, and I actually don't really need to do this expansion, but basically I just want to take the file path of the URL and use that for the icon. Then on the top title label, and if I just bring up my window here, right, so the image view is mapping, this little image here is mapping to this call where we get the icon for a given file path. The text field is going to be the title label thing here, which we're just going to get by deleting the last path extension and then getting that last path component, which is really just the title of the file. And then the last subtitle is just deleting the last path component entirely, and we would try to abbreviate with tilde and path if we can. There's some limitations to this if you're dealing with if you're just dealing with paths that are in sandbox applications, but that's a little bit beyond the point. Anyway, that's what we have for this cell here. And the very last thing I've gone ahead and set up is just the matching nib file. And again, I just didn't want to spend too much time with the constraints here. It's a fairly simple cell. The cell itself is just, I set it up using a height of 45, which I think matches about what Xcode has. There's an image view. So it's just a simple image view, which is mapped to the NS table cell view's image property. And then there's the text field here that's mapped to that. And then there's another smaller label that is mapped to that subtitle text field or subtitle label that I have in the file table cell view, right? So really nothing too complicated here, just a couple of constraints. I put these guys in a stack view, and that's it. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to leave those questions in the comments below. But what I want to focus on in this video is how we can actually get the table view set up for this recent table view controller. So first off, let's head over to the recents table view controller. And so we have gone ahead and added a visual effect view in here for now. And what I want to do is add a few more things. So obviously I want to add a table view. I'm going to go ahead and throw that into here. And I want the, so this is actually on the scroll view that I'm making these constraints. And I just want all the edges of the scroll view pinned there. Additionally, I want no border type on the scroll view itself. So that should be what's there. If I want to customize the table view itself, we just dig into the table view on this side here. And we only want one column. We don't want any headers. None of them should be resizable, no reordering. The sizing, I don't really know if this matters much, but I guess there's not really any column sizing that we're doing here. The style, you could use either inset or source list. I'm just going to use source list because I think it matches kind of the style that Xcode has in its presentation of the cell itself. I'm going to delete this built-in cell that's already here, so I can just select it and hit the delete key. And that will get rid of the cell for me there. All right, so that should be everything. I'm trying to think of other things that might need to be set up, but I'm sure I'll come back to it if I need to. All right, the last thing I want to set up is an additional label. And so I'm just going to plop in this label, and to put it, so I don't actually want to embed it in the table view. I want to embed it in the visual effect view that I added. So I'm just going to drag it over on the left side here and drop it in. And that'll put it as a subview of the visual effect view. And then I'm simply going to center this label there. Then the text color, I think it's the secondary label text color. And the font size is, I think, regular. I think it's just a little bit larger of like a size 16 font, but we can always adjust that. And then I just want the text of no recent projects. So let's go ahead and change that. And there we go. So we'll have this label that we can access later on. And basically we'll hide the label if there is content, and we will not hide the label if there is no content. All right, now that we've set that up, let's go back to our, actually we'll stay here and we'll just go ahead and set up some of our outlets that we want. So we can open up the assistant editor, and this should open up, but maybe not. Sometimes Xcode is tricky like that. All right, well, I guess we'll do it manually. So we'll go over to the recents table view. I want an IB outlet for the label that we just had there. So I'll make this private, and we're going to have a no recents label, which is just an NS text field. And then we want another outlet, which is going to be our table view, NS table view. And this just reminds me that I wanted to change the table view type that we had here. So again, I'm going to select the table view, and remember that subclass called table view that I made. I actually want to change that. So I want my class here to be table view, not just the standard NS table view. All right, so now that we have that, we're going to set this up using some of the diffable data store stuff that was introduced in Catalina, I think. And to do that, I'm just going to make a table view data source, and it's going to be an NS table view diffable data source with int URL, and that matches basically to the section type and the item type. All right, and then lastly, there's going to be the ability to inject into this, and I'm going to make this a let. Arguably, we might want to be able to change the URLs at a later point, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. All right, so we just have our URLs here, and now I want to make an initializer so that I can actually initialize those URLs. So we'll do URLs, URL, and we'll assign our URLs, and then we're going to call super.init with nib name, string, describing, recent table view. Actually, I'll just use self.self, and the bundle will be nil. All right, there we go. Now that we've done that, it's going to complain that we need to also implement this required initializer, and I'm just going to mark this guy as not available, unavailable, like so. All right, now that we've gone ahead and done that, let's go ahead and set up some of our properties here for view to load, or our, different properties. So we have our table view, and let's get that guy fully set up. So what I want to do is set up the double action on the table view, and this allows me to, like I was talking earlier, if I double click or hit the return key because of my subclass, it's going to be able to trigger an action for me. And so we'll set the target to be ourself, and the table view needs a double action. And I'm going to go ahead and implement that double action below. So this needs to be an Objective-C method so that it can be dynamic. Double action, and we could call this maybe something a little bit more appropriate, but that's what I'm calling it here. And then the sender is going to be the NS table view. All right. And then what we want to do here is I'm just going to do something really simple where, because we're not actually going to implement the opening of this because we don't actually have a document-based application, we'll talk about that in another video, perhaps where we integrate this into a document-based application. But for now, we don't have any documents, so I'm just going to essentially print out whatever the selected row is. So I'm just going to say open index and then put in selected row. All right, so the double action, now that we have one, we can say selector, and the selector is just the double action. Perfect. All right, now to actually configure the table view, we need to actually tell it what kind of cell we want to present, and we already went ahead and created that file table view cell. So we're going to register a new nib, and that's going to map to the the file table cell view that we have. I'm going to make a little bit of a variable here just so I can reuse this, and it's going to be the cell identifier, and it's going to be an NS user interface item identifier. It's kind of a long name, but that's what it is. And I want to reuse the file table cell view. All right, I'm just creating a temporary variable for this, or a variable for this, so that I can reuse it later on. To here, we want to create an NS nib, and the nib is going to be the nib named. The nib named is just going to be file table cell view bundle nil. For the identifier, it's going to be that cell identifier that I just created. All right, now we've completely configured the table view itself. We want to now set up the table view diffable data source. So we'll go ahead and create that. NS table view diffable data source. And again, it's going to be an int URL. And now we just want to initialize one. So we initialize it with the table view, and then we have to implement this cell provider. So table view column is going to be column section URL. All right, so now we just want to create that the file table cell view, and we want to configure that. So to do this, we simply say garlet cell, and we access table views. We want to make a view with the particular cell identifier, and the owner will be nil. With that, we can just say we want it to be a file table cell view. And if this fails for some reason, this would fail generally because we didn't actually register a nib to go along with this. But I need to basically return some kind of NS view because it's not optional. So I'm just going to, in theory, create one if I needed to. All right, now that we have that, we can go ahead and do cell.configure. And that's that configuration method that I have on that file table cell view. It's going to set up everything based off of the URL that I pass into it, and then we'll return the cell. All right, I know this is a little bit lengthy, and sorry for most of the rambling, but that's what we need to do to set up that diffable data source. And now to actually configure the data source with the given URLs, right? So we are injecting a list of URLs into this view controller, and the idea is that I want to create an actual data source snapshot based on those URLs. So we can do that by creating a snapshot. And the snapshot is an NS diffable data source snapshot. And it's going to have the same type as our table view data source here. And now we just need to configure it. So we want to append a section, and it's going to just be one section, which is 0. And then we need to append items, and the items are just going to be our URLs, like so. Now that we have the snapshot created, we need to assign it to the data source. So apply this snapshot, and we don't need to animate the changes since this is just going to be in view to load anyway. All right, so that should be pretty much everything we want to do to actually set up the data source. Before we go further with a little bit more configuration in this view controller, I just want to set it up so that we can actually use this initializer for the recents table view. So to do that, we want to head over to our welcome window, which is where we actually set up our recents table view controller. And so let's configure it with some content. So I actually have a URL that's sitting on my desktop, and I'm just going to kind of fill in that URL. So it's a file URL with path, and the path I'm going to give it is just this long one here. All right, so once you've added your URL, we should be good to go with the changes. So let's go ahead and run this to see if we actually configured everything correctly. And I did screw up something, and the thing I screwed up was I never actually set up our table view. So let's go back to our recents table view nib here. And this is when that assistant editor is helpful, but when you don't have it, you sometimes forget things. All right, so we need to set up the table view. So I just drag that over the table view, and then I need to also set up the recents label, so I'll set that up as well. All right, let's go ahead and run this again. So here we go. We actually have a little bit of an issue here where the content is actually going to be a little small, so let's go ahead and fix that. The other issue is that it should actually be matching along the top, which means that my basically the content's not really going all the way to the top, and that's probably because of the scroll view. So let's go ahead and fix some of these things. So on the table view itself, I want to go over to this little adjustments inspector, and we want to use automatic layout, and the explicit size actually I'm going to use is 45. All right, and then the other thing was with the scroll view. So the scroll view, I don't want to automatically adjust content insets, so it should just have no content insets. I think that should be enough. Let's just go ahead and run this again. And there we go. We can see that now the content is appropriately at the top of the view here. All right, so we have a few issues with this. Basically, one of them is that the actual file contents are not really being discovered, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe why that is in just a bit. But other than that, it looks pretty good. We want to change a few things though, where this recents project label, we need to actually tell it so that it's going to basically not show up when there is content. So let's go ahead and address that. So back in our recents table view controller, if we have URLs, this is the case where we don't have URLs, or rather it is not empty, right? So we have URLs. If we do have URLs, then we want to say no recents label is going to be hidden if we have URLs. And if we do have URLs, we actually want to do another thing, which is that we want to tell the table view to select the first item. You notice that if I go into Xcode's version, it'll always select that first item in the table view like that. So we want to do that, and to do that, we just simply say select row indices, And the index we want to select is 0 because we know we have at least a URL, and so this will select the first one, and no, we are not extending the selection. All right, let's go ahead and run that. And there we go. We can actually see that there is now a selection on the table view. We have a little issue with the person that's going to be first responder here, but we'll talk about some of those things in a later video. The last thing that we'll notice though is that basically, so we did fix our label not showing up incorrectly. The thing that we want to test is to make sure that the label will show up if we did have no URL. So let's just do a theoretical change here where we pass in no URLs, and we can see that the no recent projects label will show up correctly in that case. So that looks good. All right, let's go back over here and put that logic back in. So one of the last issues we were having was that we couldn't see that image when we actually ran the project, right? So the URL itself wasn't really figuring out where this image was, and this mostly comes down to the fact that we don't actually have an actual URL that's sandboxed in this case. For the purposes of this testing, I'm just going to switch our environment to be no for using an app sandbox. And then we can see that we will actually get the icon now, and the URL itself will actually correctly condense itself, whereas before it would actually just show the entire URL. So it's a little strange in that we need to do this, but we'll come back to this when we integrate this whole project into a document-based application and see how we can get that to work. But as you can see, we're pretty close to exactly what the Welcome to Xcode window is. The other thing that we wanted to test was to make sure that we can both double-click on these cells and hit the return key. So I actually don't have my my console open to show that, but let's do that again. So if I double-click on this, we can see that I get the open index, and also if I hit the return key, we also have the same behavior occurring in there, and that's the behavior that I wanted. So anyway, this is pretty much all that you need really to get almost an identical view of the Welcome to Xcode window. The last things we're going to do is we're going to wrap this all up into using real URLs for a document-based application, and then we'll talk about all the little small details around how to open up this panel in that video as well. All right, I'll see you guys then. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. Ways to contribute and additional information are in the description. I'll see you next week.